Hello, attendees for the Virtual Jamf Nation User Conference 2022. This session is titled Don't Fear the Framework. I'm Katie English, and I'm on the product team here at Jamf. This session is really meant as a kind of post-jumpstart refresher about what we call the framework of Jamf Pro. I'll go through the various components we might refer to, how all the pieces can work together, and how you can adopt better practices to lead to greater success with your Jamf Pro workflows. So we'll start at the top. There are a number of ways to think about the entire framework of management tools as they're deployed with Jamf Pro. The easiest way to think about it is in terms of Mac management, since there are two distinct flavors of management tools for macOS, as represented by the first two bullets on the slide. The first and oldest flavor of Mac management is the Jamf binary, which is an executable that lives at /user/local/bin/jamf, which periodically connects to the Jamf Pro management server to check for new actions to take, in what is effectively a pull type of action. The second type of management for macOS is MDM, which stands for Mobile Device Management, which, despite its name, is not limited to what we think of as mobile devices. MDM is a push-based flavor of management for settings and commands. So, in our framework, we have a pull and we have a push. And of course, part of the benefit for Pro admins is that you can connect to a variety of your organization's ancillary infrastructure, directory services, certificate services, as well as other services hosted by Apple. All these different pieces can interact when we're talking about the Jamf Pro framework, which means, unfortunately, that the definition of that framework can be a bit imprecise because your organization might look a little different than anyone else's and might use different components based on your infrastructure needs. But let's focus on the parts of the framework that are fairly predictable for Mac admins, and that's the combination I mentioned earlier, which is the Jamf binary as well as MDM. We'll dig into these technologies at a high level and talk about how you can use them together to effectively manage your Macs. You'll also notice that App Installers merits a special mention in this section, as that's a newer feature in Jamf Pro and can definitely introduce some ambiguity in regard to familiar patch workflows. So first, let's talk about the binary. As I mentioned, this is the older style of device management, and it's been around since the Casper Suite was first conceived. It's an executable that lives on the Mac, that phones home to the Jamf Pro server, and effectively asks, hey, should I be doing something right now? The Jamf Pro server replies yes or no. And if the answer is yes, the client might be directed to do something. That something may be visit this web address, download a package to install. It may be run a script. It may be update your inventory. The thing to remember about this style of communication is that it's invoked from the client itself. The Jamf binary is installed with a launch daemon that grants the binary root level access on the Mac and is scheduled to periodically phone home to discover new tasks. Alternately, an end user may invoke the Jamf binary by way of an action in self-service, or an admin may invoke a remote command that calls the Jamf binary by command line or script. The tasks the Jamf binary does may be specific, like run this particular policy that downloads and installs a managed web browser, or maybe very general, like, hey, it's been 15 minutes since I last checked in. Am I in scope for anything new? In contrast, the Jamf binary management protocol is pretty different from MDM, which uses Apple's push notification functionality. So let's take a look at how that workflow goes. In an MDM type of management action, the action actually starts at the Jamf Pro server itself, either because a device has fallen into scope for a new setting or command, or because an admin has manually invoked an MDM command targeting that device. The Jamf Pro server sends a message to Apple's push notification service to say, please have this managed device phone home. The device, which is somewhere out in the world, actually maintains a persistent outbound connection to Apple's push notification services, which means that when Apple occasionally pulls on that string, the response is very quick, nearly instantaneous. The direction Apple provides to the device in a non-management context might be, have your mail.app check your email server. But in the case of Jamf Pro management, the direction is, phone home to your management server. When the device does, the management server may provide a variety of responses. Something like, here's a command to download a configuration profile with new settings. here's an app to go download from an in-house URL. Or maybe here's a command to go download an app from the App Store. There are two key points to remember about the communication paths for these two different pieces of the Jamf Pro framework. The first is that the starting locations are different. The Jamf binary is invoked from the managed Mac client, whereas MDM communication is started by the management server. The second point is the relative speed of the delivery of the management actions. I mentioned that MDM is very fast. It's generally way faster to get started than a binary action. A binary action may be queued up and is just sort of waiting for a device to hit its scheduled time to phone home to find out that it has something to do, rather than the very nearly instantaneous round trip of MDM communication when Jamf Pro asks Apple services to have a device phone home. So that's a high-level review of the different management communication protocols for macOS. Now that you know the difference between them, let's talk about how you can make these tools work together. Mac admins are really familiar with Jamf Pro policies. They're specifically an example of a workflow that the Jamf binary invokes. The common outcomes of a policy action are that a script could be run on the client, or possibly a package is downloaded and installed from a distribution point. On the other hand, you also have MDM options for a Mac. These would include configuration profiles, MDM actions, which are commands run against a device or group of devices, and app installation from the App Store. I mentioned Jamf Pro's app installers are newer. They also fall into this category as well. It might not be super obvious, but Jamf app installers actually use the MDM command install enterprise application, which gives a high degree of security and verifiability in regard to how the app package contents are sourced and verified prior to installation. And this is where things get a little bit complicated. As a Mac admin, you probably want to do something that seems fairly straightforward. I want to deploy an app. I want to deploy some settings for that app. It's important to remember that the app and the settings are going to be two separate objects in Jamf Pro, and for Macs, they'll generally end up being deployed separately. This is really one of the most common workflows that we're talking about when we refer to that framework. It's combining these two different objects, which might be deployed by very different management protocols, and making sure your end users get all the bits they need in the order that they need them. So let's walk through an example. You have an app you want to deploy. The first thing you have to consider is, where's the app located? Is it an in-house app? A package that you've uploaded to your distribution point? Then your deployment mechanism is going to be a policy. Your managed Macs will periodically phone home, and when they discover that they're in scope for the installation policy, they'll download and install the app in that package. You might also deploy an app via apps and books, or maybe Jamf app installers. Apps delivered by those methods will use MDM, which means the servers will queue up the command to install the app from either the App Store URL or the app installer storage URL, then prompt Apple push notification services to have your device's phone home to retrieve that command. Again, nearly instantaneous for that part. Now, keep in mind, both of these app install command styles will ultimately do what you need. Get the app installed from the source you've designated. A policy might take longer for a device to initiate, but the Jamf binary gives us more robust feedback and logging while we're waiting for the policy to complete. An MDM command might start off more quickly, but unfortunately our view into MDM actions while they're processing can be fairly opaque. Large apps might take a long time to install with little to no end user feedback. But installing the app is really only half the story, right? You also want to deploy settings alongside the app so that your end users get the best possible experience when they launch it. There are a number of ways to deliver those settings, all derived from older Mac management tech called MCX. The modern way, the way you'll want to embrace, is by way of configuration profiles. Now, a configuration profile is simply an encoded text document with keys and key definitions in it. Those keys vary across applications and might not be super easy to discover, but thankfully our admin community is a great source for that information. So, a very common use case would be you're deploying an internet browser and you want your organization's intranet page to be the homepage at launch. You would discover or create the profile definition you want. You would either upload a copy of it to Jamf Pro or use the built-in application and custom settings functionality to create it for you, set the homepage to your internal URL, and deploy it. Easy, right? Yes, but keep in mind that profiles are delivered by MDM, so they're very fast. So fast, in fact, that if you scope a policy or an app installer process at the same time you scope the profile will likely arrive on the computer well before the app itself does. And the secret here is that's actually completely okay. The profile can simply sit there until the settings are referred to by the application launch, whenever that happens after the installation. So you might be thinking, since an app and the settings are two separate objects, how do I think about scope? In this case, it's actually really convenient that they're separate objects. You can mirror the scope for the app and settings for the same target devices, no problem. But it may be advantageous to scope the app and settings separately. If, for example, you have a user acceptance testing workflow wherein either the version of the app or the settings applied are different for a particular set of your end users. Which brings me to the first time we talk about order of operations in regard to the Jamf Pro framework. These are my best practice reminders to help admins succeed. And just as a spoiler, you're going to see these again. First, you have to consider the scope. Like I mentioned, there are great reasons to reuse scoping logic regardless of the object you're deploying. There are also great reasons to keep them separate, but don't feel like you have to create separate scoping logic just because of the management protocol used to deploy the object, whether that's the binary or MDM. And that leads me to the second point. Both the binary and MDM will work for deploying content to your devices, but you just want to be mindful of which one is in use and what the expected outcomes will be. A policy may take longer for a device to initiate, but it may give you greater flexibility in regard to end-user interaction and logging the results. MDM is faster for the initiation process, but it might feel like a bit of a black box that you can't inspect until after it's done processing. Remember that configuration profiles are delivered by MDM and may end up on the device well before an associated app does, even if those objects are scoped the same devices at the same time. And finally, looking ahead, we can expect MDM workflows to become more mature, and you can expect more Jamf workflows to move to MDM first technology over time. Just like how app installers uses that install enterprise application command, you can expect we'll iterate on that kind of implementation, and we'll collaborate with our other technology partners to optimize that experience over time. Policies aren't dead, by the way, not by a long shot, but we've definitely got some work to do to enhance them with the benefits of MDM. So stay tuned on that one. And that's one version of the Jamf Pro framework, combining two different management protocols to deploy content to your managed Macs. Now I'll move on to another aspect of the framework, using Jamf tools together. For these examples, I'll be talking about using Jamf Pro to work with Jamf Connect and Jamf Protect, as well as using Jamf Pro to remediate the framework on managed Macs if binary communication ever fails. In Jamf Pro 10.34 and later, you'll see options in your settings for integrations with Jamf Connect and Jamf Protect. There's a technical paper that goes into great detail on these integrations titled Deploying Jamf Platform Products Using Jamf Pro to Connect, Manage, and Protect Mac Computers. Bit of a mouthful. We'll talk about at the very high level how these pieces work here today. Remember that Jamf Connect allows you to create local passwords on a managed Mac with passwords that sync to your organization's identity provider. Jamf Protect is an endpoint security agent using native macOS security frameworks to protect your managed computers. Both of these tools behave a lot like the scenario we discussed before. They consist of a package and settings. Jamf Protect is a little bit different because it has its own framework and console that a Mac reports to. You can integrate that framework with the Jamf Pro framework to make deployment and maintenance easier. Basically, two different Jamf product frameworks can extend each other. To make this work, you initiate a token exchange from Jamf Pro with the Jamf Cloud Services Authenticator to authorize an account lookup and connect your Pro web app to the configured APIs on your Protect tenant. Once the frameworks are communicating, Jamf Pro will be aware of the plans for endpoint security as configured in Jamf Protect and can handle the deployment of the Protect agent and associated settings to devices already managed in Jamf Pro. In that way, the Pro framework and the Protect framework are really quite similar. There's an agent that lives on the Mac, There are settings deployed alongside the agent, and each agent has a synchronization process and updates for their respective management consoles. By connecting the frameworks together, we're reducing the overhead of both systems, really. Get your devices enrolled in Pro, get Pro connected to Protect, use Pro to deploy and to update Protect on those devices, and the framework kind of just takes care of itself. And while Jamf Connect doesn't have a specific console to log into like Jamf Protect does, the Cloud Services Authenticator process is effectively the same way to permit Jamf Pro to automatically deploy and update Jamf Connect to your managed devices by communicating with the Jamf product package repository that you see in the upper right of the slide. So let's say you've got that token-based authentication completed, and your Jamf Pro is successfully talking to the Jamf product repository. Now that that's done, we'll talk through how to work with Connect. Again, just like our earlier scenario, Connect is really just a package and some settings. Those settings are going to be easiest to work with by way of a configuration profile, which, you'll remember, is just an encoded text document with keys and key definitions within it, distributed by MDM. In Jamf Pro, if you look at computer configuration profiles, you'll notice a payload called Application and Custom Settings. In there, you'll see a few different options, but the one to focus on right now is called Jamf Applications. From there, you can select the com.jamf.connect application domain and the version you're deploying. You'll see all the options available to configure Jamf Connect to talk to your identity provider. Remember that these settings will be distributed very quickly and could in fact be scoped to devices well prior to Jamf Connect even being installed on the computer, and that's still okay. They'll just sort of sit there until the app is installed and launched, at which point it'll look for those settings. Once you get a Jamf Connect configuration profile created or uploaded after you create it via our utility, you can visit the integration options in the setting page in Jamf Pro to set up automatic installation and update of the Jamf Connect app on the scope devices. Now, if you use that automatic installation object, it'll be deployed by MDM, just like our app installers. However, you can also download the package and deploy it by policy, which could be helpful if you have more rigid version control needs. It's easy to use the framework options to mix deployment styles to match your organization's requirement. Now, getting back to Jamf Protect, you also have a similar choice. You can use the framework connection to automatically deploy and update the Protect package by MDM. You can allow the Protect agent to update itself by a pull mechanism to the Protect console, or you can download the package manually and upload it to your distribution point to install by way of a policy, which we're back to the Jamf binary. In any case, you'll want to make sure that you've got the configuration profiles pulled in from your Protect tenant to make sure the settings are distributed to the right clients as well. So, for a quick recap, the framework that we're talking about can actually extend to other Jamf products, specifically Connect and Protect. Both Connect and Protect are agents or apps that will get installed as packages on a Mac alongside settings to configure their behavior. You have the choice about how those packages behave. You can use the integrations offered to automate installation and update. You can also download the packages manually, separately, treat them like traditional in-house apps, upload them to your distribution point, and install them by policy. You can use MDM, Jamf binary, or a mix of both. So, kind of changing gears a little tiny bit, we're going to bring the focus on the framework back to just the components of Jamf Pro. When a Mac gets enrolled, it gets the Jamf binary and it gets an MDM profile. Sometimes a device gets into an unhealthy state for various reasons, and one component, usually the Jamf binary, stops phoning home. This can obviously be really problematic for your managed devices, so fortunately, there's a way to recover. As of Jamf Pro 10.36, there's an API endpoint called Jamf Management Framework Redeploy. Basically, if you're still able to send MDM commands to the device, you can use this MDM command to invoke a reinstallation of the other components of the Jamf Management Framework, including the binary and self-service and the associated config files, to reestablish that binary communication and regain full framework functionality. It effectively triggers a re-enrollment event, making sure that all of your standard apps and settings get reinforced on the device. So, with all that in mind, when using the Jamf frameworks together, there are a few things to remember in regard to better practices. This is going to look familiar. First, consider the scope. In the case of multiple product frameworks working together, it is more important than ever to make sure your target device groups make sense. And you want to minimize duplication and recalculation. Apps and settings can be scoped to the same groups, and settings can get delivered prior to the apps being installed. In the case of the Jamf Connect and Jamf Protect integrations, you'll want the target device groups well understood before you get started, especially if you're using the automatic installation and update features. As for scope, when using the management framework redeploy endpoint, there's a reason it's meant to target only one computer ID at a time. Device communication can fail for various reasons, but it's unusual for the management framework to require significant upkeep. If you're encountering framework failures with any frequency, I'd really encourage you to chat that over with Jamf support. Otherwise, this endpoint is available to you as a troubleshooting option when you do rarely need it. Our second point, consider the source. Again, this bit gets a bit more complex when you're working with product integrations, so it's worth spending time to think about your desired end state. It's also worth scoping small to start with. You can use the automated tools to keep things up to date quickly, or you can download packages and distribute them with your own version control in mind. Finally, considering the future. As a longtime admin myself, I admit it would make a lot of sense to be wary of automatic update workflows and feel like you have to maintain that kind of control when you're starting off. I get it. But don't forget that the automation exists. You might find that you want to convert and save yourself the effort by letting the framework do the heavy lifting for you. Okay. Up until now, I've been talking about the framework as something that's really pretty exclusive to Macs. That's technically true, in that the Jamf Management Framework specifically refers to the Jamf binary and the associated settings and helper bits that get installed on a managed Mac. However, the problems we solve on mobile devices are really very similar to the problems that we solve on a Mac. We just exclusively use MDM to solve them. So let's take a look. I've captured two specific examples here. App config, which would be settings delivered alongside a mobile app, and per app VPN, which is a profile you deliver to the device to govern the network traffic of apps or domains in mobile Safari. What's convenient is we're really just talking about the same problem we've been talking about all along, an app and some settings that dictate the app's behavior. The quickest way to see this in action is to take a look at your app in your mobile device app catalog. You'll notice an option for app configuration. And if you're looking at this text thinking, this is just a text document with keys and key definitions, you're right. It looks an awful lot like the configuration profiles we've been working with all the way up until this point. Now, not every app supports app config. Some actually require it to work properly, and discovering those settings can definitely be a challenge. You'll notice I put a link to the appconfig.jamfresearch.com site at the bottom of the slide. Give it a look. Check out the repository of apps that we already have in the catalog, and maybe you'll spot some helpful options to deploy alongside the apps you use the most. There are Jamf apps that require app config to work. The example on screen is Jamf Setup, but the most common one you'd likely use is Jamf Self-Service for iOS. And I mentioned per app VPN earlier. It's a slightly different app challenge. There you're working with a configuration profile, which is delivered by the VPN payload with a per app VPN selected, and you'll have to designate the specific domains that must invoke that VPN connection. If you're using a tool like Jamf Trust, you'll have to set the Jamf Trust identifier to make sure the traffic is routed per domain by the VPN app to the appropriate corporate resource. It is a bit confusing. You deploy the setting to the device, not alongside each app like with app config. Which leads me to better practices one last time. When working with mobile apps and settings, the scope can actually be a bit more complicated than on your Macs. If you have different versions of app config to be deployed to different groups of devices, you'll have to be careful about how the app is added to your app catalog. You might need to rename objects in the app catalog to ensure the items are unique with the correct app config attached. In this case, the source is likely to be the App Store, but consider that apps that require MDM will require app config as well. You could totally download iOS self-service on an unmanaged device, but without that app config, it's going to be pretty useless. And finally, while I've very confidently stated that on Macs, settings can be delivered before apps, that's just not the case for app config on mobile devices. You'll need to plan to get the settings delivered concurrently in order for the app to work properly. Looking toward the future, this is mostly an indication that app config is going to get more interesting as developers continue to embrace it, and Jamf's own products will continue to integrate to make the deployment process more streamlined over time. So, to sum up those better practices that we've now revisited a few times, you and Jamf are going to be more successful long term if we're adapting to MDM workflows. That doesn't mean the binary is dead. It just means that we're going to have to do some work to modernize its behavior. When you're working with scope, try to minimize group creation. Use an exception-based workflow for deployments where apps and settings stick together, unless a testing workflow requires some different configuration. Because the MDM portion of the framework tends to be very fast, you might find yourself delivering settings prior to an app, and that's okay. Just remember that on mobile devices, you probably need to examine your approach to ensure apps and settings are delivered at the same time. And finally, I know the framework can be overwhelming. It does a lot, it does it in different ways, and what works for one kind of device might not work for another. But here's the thing. For Apple device management, there's usually about 4 different ways to solve any given problem. Find the thing that works for you and stick with it. If you're all in on policy workflows, that's fine. If you want the speed of MDM, that works too. We'll be working on enhancing the whole picture, so stay tuned for our updates as we continue to enhance Jamf Pro and its framework. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of JNUC 2022.